So last night we saw George Groves versus Andrea De Luisa. A few weeks previously we saw David Haye versus Mark Demori. Having seen these two fights and two fighters, I wanted to talk a little bit about the potential influence of young Mr. Mcguigan on both of these fighters. Now I know it's very early days. I know both of them have only had one fight under the new regime. And I know they both had fights against overmatched opponents who they were able to knock out relatively quickly, specifically in David Haye's example. But is it possible we could start seeing some similarities, some changes and some nuances to the game that have been introduced by the new regime? Possibly. So I wanted to talk about those. You know, of course, when you're talking about two fights, one fight for either man, there's always a chance there could be a coincidence in there rather than necessarily a set change in mentality or a set change in game plan that's been implemented by Mcguigan. But nevertheless, I was keen to discuss. Let me start by saying George Groves, David Haye, similar type of fighters historically. And there's no surprise that they are similar type of fighters. Number one, both trained by Adam Booth historically. And I see David Haye as a massive influence for George Groves. I think George Groves learnt a lot from David Haye, inside and outside the ring. They've got a similar persona. Both like to think of themselves as businessmen within boxing. And stylistically, they're not dissimilar fighters. I viewed them as quite athletic, outside fighters who ambush opponents. Very, very explosive, very agile. Lots of movement, lots of head movement, lots of reflexes. And then, a real assault with explosive power, rushing in on an opponent and essentially being quite destructive, not disruptive. So I guess I viewed them as similar fighters, not necessarily the greatest tacticians or technicians, not necessarily the most advanced chess players, explosive athletes with great agility, great speed, great punching power who can ambush opponents. That's how I viewed them. Now, both guys have had high-profile losses. Obviously, David Haye, most notably to Vladimir Klitschko, George Groves to Carl Frotz, and both guys are getting older. I know George Groves is still a relatively young man, but he's had a lot of fights. He's got a few miles on the clock, a few tough 12-round fights, a few tough losses against Carl Frotz. And again, both guys have got styles, historically, that don't necessarily age overly well. I've talked about this before, but guys like Bernard Hopkins who fight on to the age of 50, I don't see that in David Haye. I don't see that in George Groves. For me, they're more sort of explosive, reaction, reflex type fighters who are probably going to be at their best in their 20s and 30s as opposed to 40s and 50s. So it's no surprise that after a few losses, they are potentially reconsidering doing things differently in the ring and reconsidering different styles, I guess. And when both guys signed with Shane Mcguigan, a lot of us, including myself, voiced the opinion that this could potentially be because they view Shane Mcguigan as a more affordable option than Adam Booth. Potentially he would charge them less money out of their purse. Mcguigan was known as someone who could get fighters very, very fit. And both of them, they're quite arrogant guys, they're quite egotistical guys, they're already very developed in their careers. They're probably not looking for a trainer here to take them back to square one, work on the basics. They probably think they've got it made, and as such they were happy to go for a younger guy in Mcguigan. But I think, and as I say, this is just an early instinct, and this is more speculation from my part, as it is too early to say definitively, but I think having seen these guys fight under Mcguigan, there is a subtle change in the way they're approaching fights stylistically. And I think that there may be an influence here from Barry Mcguigan. The older Mcguigan is seen as quite a calm guy outside of the ring, more of a quiet type guy, I guess you could say at times, but he has been taking some sort of role here. I know he's been in towards David Haye and George Groves sparring. Yesterday we saw him managing the glove situation on behalf of George Groves. He was checking Andrea De Luisa's gloves and hand wrapping and that sort of stuff. So this guy's involved, and it's no surprise with fathers in boxing that he's staying involved. And I think he's got a real influence in this camp. Either that he's directly involved, or just in the fact that Shane Mcguigan is a younger guy. Barry's obviously his father. they're working quite closely together, and a lot of the things he's saying and the way he approaches the sport is rubbing off on his son, which is kind of understandable. But whilst Shane Mcguigan, if you like, is the figurehead, is the one we see working the corner, is the one we see doing the press fight interviews, I don't rule out that there's some influence from Barry here, and that he has perhaps taken a more active role than what we've seen in the press would suggest. Regardless, whether it's father or whether it's son, let me say what I've noticed from both David Haye and George Groves. And really, it's going to be three things that I refer to here. Number one. Actually, before we get to the three things I've noticed, let me just make one other point. The two issues, actually the three issues, so I keep changing my mind here, the three issues that people have had with both David Haye and George Groves throughout their careers are actually the same three issues, I think. Number one, people have been critical of their chins. George Groves got knocked out by Carl Frost. People have always criticised David Haye's chin after he's been dropped a few times. Carl Thompson fight. I always felt the criticism of David Haye's chin was a bit unfair. I don't think he does have a glass chin. But regardless, both people question their punch resistance. Linked into that, both people have often questioned whether they cut too much weight. George Groves to get down to 168. David Haye initially to get down to 200. And then secondarily, was he fighting too light at heavyweight? And thirdly, stamina. Neither guy is seen as a real 12-round warrior, stamina-type fighter. They're both viewed as guys who can potentially be drowned late on in fights. They're both viewed as guys who can possibly have questionable stamina reserves. So I think that there are huge similarities between David Haye and George Groves, how they fight historically. I also think their suggested weaknesses are similar. Chin, weight, stamina. Now I've seen three changes in both of their games over the course of one fight, as I say. So this is speculation rather than fact. I note that both guys come out a lot slower pace, a lot more reserved, composed, relaxed, however you want to phrase it. Maybe even cautious, They're not going out and putting the pedal to the metal straight away. I was at the David Haye Chisora fight, or look at the Groves Frost one fight. They come out like bulls in a china shop, throwing punches with bad intentions, trying to knock opponents out from the first punch. In both of these two fights, and this may sound like a strange comment given the fact that they both ended in early knockouts, but that's more to do with the calibre of opposition. I've seen the Haye and Groves come out more cautious, having a look at their opponent, having a bit of a think, not necessarily charging straight in, taking it slightly easier. That's one big thing I've noticed, more looking to pick the spots than force the pace round one. The second thing I've noticed is the jab. Now, George Groves has always had a fantastic jab. He was using it very, very well against Andre De Luisa. I guess previously Groves has had a very good jab, so this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, but they've certainly put the emphasis back on the jab for George Groves. With David Haye, however, David Haye is a fighter who hasn't always used a jab. He's more feinted with a jab and then lunged in, haymakered in. But for me, the development of David Haye throwing a jab and the beginning of George Groves, George Groves re-establishing that jab is some suggestion that they are working on that in training camp. And if you listen to what Carl Frampton was saying yesterday in Sky Commentary, who's another one in the Mcguigan camp, he was going on and on and on about the jab. For me, it's clear that in the training camp, in the gym, the jab is a key focus. Finally, David Haye and George Groves, neither of them are body punchers. I do not see either of those guys at elite level body punchers historically. What you'll notice in both of their combat fights is they both land really nice shots to the body, real nice punches to the body. And I actually think this is quite shrewd changes to their games by Mcguigan's, because I actually think it very directly addresses the potential frailties within their games. Fighters, David Haye, George Groves, you could say they struggle to go 12 rounds. Well, what you see is them coming out slower, having a look at opponents, not wasting a load of energy early on. You see them punching to the body, wears out an opponent, tries to take away their stamina, tries to make sure the opponent isn't coming on strong late in fights. Uses the jab, keeps it at range. What I'm getting at is, as these guys are getting older, and bearing in mind I've already said in my opinion their styles won't necessarily age well, I'm seeing both of them making a subtle transition to more chess playing boxers, to more thinking boxers, to more technical, tactical boxers, as opposed to explosive athletes who are on a seek and destroy mission. And for me, it's no coincidence that we're seeing the exact same type of fighters with the exact same type of frailties making the exact same changes in their first fights for Mcguigan. Never before have I seen either man punch to the body like they were doing, yet they both started doing that. Never before have I seen them come out of the trap so slowly, but they both started doing that. I've never seen David Haye use the jab like that before. He tended to lead with power shots for my liking. Maybe I'm overstating it here, and as I say, this probably is reflective of a low level of opposition, but I am seeing changes that have been implemented by the Mcguigans, whether that's father or whether that's son. I'm seeing subtle changes which are changing them from more athletes to chess players, and I think it's a good thing, because I think these guys have got to a certain level in the game using their natural skills and natural athleticism, but at this stage, when they both come up slightly short at the elite level, and when they're both not getting any younger, those small subtle changes could make the difference. And perhaps if George Groves comes out, steals the first 3 or 4 rounds behind a jab without expending much energy, has a bit of a look at an opponent, weakens him to the body a bit, perhaps we'll be less likely to see a collapse from George Groves in rounds 10, 11 and 12. For me, it's positive. It's early days. These changes will be tested more as the guys get taken out of their comfort zone and fight a higher level of opposition. But I think it's interesting, and I think the Mcguigans are making some changes. Let me know your thoughts on this. Am I barking up the wrong tree? Have I got it right? Do you like these changes? Do you think they could be beneficial? If you've enjoyed this video, do give me the thumbs up. I'd certainly appreciate it. I'm going to cover both of their next fights, obviously, so if you're interested in hearing more, hit the subscribe button. I wouldn't want you to miss out on future videos. Thanks a lot for watching.